The day I walked into that courtroom, Lorraine was already performing. Black dress, pearl earrings, moving through the gallery like she was hosting a dinner party. Her daughter Belle was filming on her phone until the bailiff made her stop. I carried one thin folder. Lorraine had a full legal team, a prepared speech, and 9 months of certainty behind her. I had 5 documents, a nurse who'd seen everything, and one piece of paper my father had quietly filed at the county recorder's office 9 years before Lorraine ever walked through his front door. She had no idea it existed, neither did I, until the night after she threw us out of his funeral, and I finally understood what a dying man had been trying to tell me. This is that story. My name is Kira Weston, was 36 years old, and by the time my stepmother finished her announcement over my father's casket, she had already lost. She just didn't know it yet. My father, Gideon, was the kind of man who ironed his own shirts on Sunday evenings and kept the receipts for appliances. He'd owned it for 20 years. He ran a regional construction materials company from a single rented warehouse into a business worth real money, and along the way he bought a grey stone house on 3 acres with iron gates at the end of a gravel drive. He used to say, "The house isn't what matters, the people inside it are, bricks you can replace." He said that a lot. I should have listened harder to what he wasn't saying. My mother passed when I was in my mid-20s. After that, Gideon rattled around that big house alone, and when a woman named Diane came into his life 3 years later, I was genuinely relieved. She was quick and warm, and she made him laugh again. The worry came in slowly, a reorganized phone, his mail rerouted through her, his calendar, then his finances, then gradually his version of events. She started answering his questions for him, started remembering plans he'd apparently made and then forgotten. Nothing criminal, everything cumulative. I filed it in the back of my mind and didn't say anything. That silence is its own kind of guilt, and I carried it for a long time. The diagnosis came on a February morning, pancreatic, already spread. For the first few weeks I drove up twice a week. My brother Owen came almost every day. He teaches high school 30 minutes from the house. We'd sit in Dad's study, which smelled of old wood and pipe tobacco even years after his doctor made him quit, and we didn't say much. We didn't need to. Then Diane changed the locks on the visiting schedule. First it was structured hours. Then a printed letter appeared on the side door, typed, official-looking, signed by his oncologist, explaining that for his immune health, visitors needed to be limited and coordinated through the household. Owen got turned away twice in the driveway without seeing him. I got a brass security chain, and Diane's voice through a 2-inch gap, telling me he was resting. I'm an operations manager by training. 8 years in the military logistics corps left me one habit I can't break. I write everything down. Date, time, who answered, what they said. I called his oncologist's office directly to ask about the restriction order. They had no record of issuing one. I wrote that down too. At the time I didn't know what to do with it. I thought maybe it was an administrative oversight. I thought maybe I was being paranoid. I thought the most important thing I could do was stay patient and not create a scene. That was the worst decision I ever made. And it wasn't even my fault. 6 weeks before he died, an envelope arrived in my mailbox, my father's handwriting. I knew it before I read the return address. The particular slope of his capital letters, the way he pressed hard on a pen like it owed him something. Inside, no letter. One torn half-sheet of his personal stationery, one line. You always kept better records than me, trust them. Folded into the page was his service medal, the one he'd carried in his left pocket for 30 years, worn smooth along one edge from handling. I sat in my car for a long time. I read it as his way of reaching through the wall Diane had built between us. His way of saying, I know what's happening and I see you. I put the medal in my jacket pocket and drove home and told myself I'd find a way to see him. That weekend. By that weekend he was past the point of knowing I was there. He died at 4:47 in the morning on a Thursday in March. I found out at 8:30 when Diane called me with the same tone she'd used to confirm a restaurant reservation. The funeral home had already been chosen. The date was set. My input was not required now. Here is the moment I need you to understand. Because everything else that happened flows from it. At the reception, held in my father's house, with his furniture and his grandfather clock and his gravel driveway, Diane stood at the foot of the main staircase and tapped a glass with a spoon. The room went quiet. She thanked everyone for coming. She talked about devotion and sacrifice, and being the person who stayed. She talked about a love the whole room could see. Then she said, as his wife, I want you to hear this clearly. Gideon left me this house, and the heart of what he built, because I was the one who was here. That's what his will says. That's what he wanted. A murmur of sympathy moved through the room like weather. She found my eyes across the crowd, held them. This was never really yours, she said. He chose, her attorney, a man named Francis Webb, who I'd later learn had also drafted the will, notarized the will, and stood to collect the executor's fee from the estate. Nodded along from the corner like punctuation. Diane waited for the room to absorb it. Then she turned to Owen and me, and lowered her voice to that particular register people use when they want everyone to overhear. She told us it would be best if we gathered ourselves and headed out. She called it her home, she said. You understand. Owen stood up so fast his chair scraped tile. I put my hand on his shoulder and pushed down until he sat, and then, in the worst possible setting, in front of every relative I had, I smiled, not broadly, not cruelly, just a small quiet thing that I couldn't stop. Because standing there in my good coat with my folder against my ribs, I had just heard her make the loudest, most public, most catastrophically overconfident mistake possible. She had bet a house in front of 40 witnesses, and she had never checked whose name was actually on the deed. In the car, Owen wanted to go back in. He wanted to stand up at that table and read the phone log out loud. Every date, every time, every name of whoever had answered and told us Dad was resting and to call another time. I understood it. I felt it, too. Hot and clean and completely useless. We don't fight noise with noise, I told him. We fight noise with paper. He stared at me. Dad was the most meticulous person we ever knew, I said. Careful people leave trails, so we find his. What I didn't tell him yet, what I was only beginning to understand, was that my father had already left a trail. One specific document, filed in public, available to anyone with the parcel number and the price of a copy. He had left it there years ago when he was healthy and clear, and he had spent some of his last energy pointing me toward it. Trust the records, he'd written. I had been carrying those words in my pocket for 6 weeks, and I had just now started to hear them correctly. The next morning I drove to the county recorder's office. It is a beige fluorescent room that smells like copy toner and does not care about your feelings, which made it my favourite place on earth at that moment. I gave the clerk my father's parcel number from an old property tax statement in my folder and asked for the full title history. She typed for a moment, frowned, printed several pages and slid them across the counter without ceremony. There it was, 7 years before Diane. My father had transferred the property out of his personal name and into the Gideon Weston Family Trust. Recorded, stamped, dated, and entirely public. The beneficiaries named on the document were his 2 children. The successor trustee, the person designated to manage the trust when he was gone, was me. He had done this when he was 62 years old and completely alone, years before he met Diane, years before any of this was anything. I stood at that counter and held the page and finally understood the envelope. Trust the records. He hadn't been reminiscing. He had been giving me directions. The thing Diane had announced over his casket. The house, the crown jewel of the estate, the whole centre of her public claim, had never been his to give. A will can only distribute what the deceased personally owned at death. He had not owned that house for 7 years. Her grand declaration at that reception had been a queen's speech delivered from a throne that belonged to someone else. I found a probate attorney named Marcus Chen who had the specific, unhurried quality of a person who has watched 100 families destroy themselves over inheritances and is no longer surprised by any of it. I spread my folder on his desk and walked him through everything, the call log, the chained door, the letter on the side door, the oncologist's callback. He listened without interrupting. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Did your father own that house in his name? I passed him the certified deed. I watched him read it again. Watched him set his pen down. If this is clean, he said, then her announcement at the funeral was theatre. The question is whether the will itself can stand and what else it reaches for. The will still claimed everything outside the trust. The business shares, the accounts, the investments, and it did something worse than claim money. It rewrote my father. A will admitted to probate becomes the official permanent record of what a person wanted. If that document stood, it would tell everyone, forever, that Gideon Weston had looked at his 2 children and deliberately chosen a stranger of 3 years. That was the part I could not let stand. I don't want more than he gave us, I told Marcus. I want the truth he'd recognise. We filed. Here is where I need to stop and tell you about the doctor's note. because I had always believed, on some level, that I'd failed him. That if I had been louder or pushier or less concerned with keeping the peace, I would have gotten past that brass chain. That my own patience had cost us those last months. The subpoena to his oncologist's office was almost routine. Marcus wanted their full records on any visitor restrictions they'd issued. The answer came back quickly. The practice had issued no such letter. They had no record of any visitor limitation. The physician confirmed in writing that the signature on the letter taped to my father's side door was not his. It had been fabricated, printed on official-looking letterhead, signed with a copied signature, and placed on that door for the specific purpose of keeping us out. The isolation hadn't been a grieving wife's instinct or a doctor's caution. It had been manufactured deliberately. On paper, I stood in Marcus's office and read that confirmation 3 times. All those nights at my kitchen table with a notebook and a phone. All those months I blamed myself for being too careful, too considerate, too unwilling to make a scene. I hadn't failed my father. I had been fighting a wall built out of forgeries. You cannot push your way past a fake doctor's signature on a side door. No amount of patience or impatience changes that. The guilt I had been carrying quietly for nearly a year loosened its grip just slightly, and then I put the letter in the file. The notary journal came back from Francis Webb under subpoena, and it was where the story cracked open. Webb's own records showed that my father had appeared in person and signed his new will on a specific Tuesday in early December. Webb had stamped it, signed it, and recorded it in the bound journal that notaries keep by law. Marcus placed the hospice nurse's clinical notes for that same Tuesday on the table beside the journal. Her records showed my father had been heavily sedated, largely unresponsive, in the final hardest phase of the decline, not receiving visitors, not lucid enough for purposeful conversation. 2 documents, both official, both stamped, calling each other liars. A man cannot be unconscious in a hospice bed in the morning and seated in an attorney's office signing legal documents in the afternoon. One of those records was real. The other had been fabricated, and there was one more detail about Francis Webb that Marcus underlined carefully. Webb hadn't just notarized the will, he had drafted it. He was named executor in it. He stood to collect a percentage of a multi-million-dollar estate for that role. The man who wrote the document, stamped the document, and stood to profit from the document were all the same man. We brought in a forensic document examiner, a woman named Dr. Sandra Price, who had spent 28 years testifying in courts about whether signatures told the truth. I gave her everything I had: the recorded deed, the letter from the envelope, tax filings, the title on his truck, a birthday card from 2 years before. She compared them to the signature on the will with magnification equipment and 2 weeks of careful work. Her report was written in the hedged, careful language that experts use in court. The meaning underneath it was plain. The signature on the will was not consistent with any of the known samples. It showed the particular characteristics of a drawn signature: slow, copying a shape rather than writing a name, pen pressure that started and stopped like someone tracing. Not Gideon Weston signing his name 10,000 times the way he always had, someone else working slowly from a model. My father had not signed that will. Someone had held a pen over his name and drawn it, while he was asking for his children from a hospice bed and couldn't hold a pen himself. The settlement offer arrived 10 days before the hearing. Marcus sat across from me and walked through the numbers, split the contested estate, everyone walks away, no trial risk, real money, one condition, a confidentiality clause, no public findings, no statement on the record about forgery, no acknowledgement of what had been done or how. Diane would keep her version of the story, and I would sign my name to an agreement that ensured it stayed clean. I thought about it for one night. The safe thing, the responsible, conflict-avoiding, adult thing, would have been to take it. The litigation had cost real money. The outcome of a trial is never certain, even with a strong case. Marcus had told me that plainly, and I believed him. But a confidentiality agreement doesn't just buy silence. It rents it permanently. It means that the official record, the public, stamped, permanent record, would read. 2 families reached a quiet resolution. It would mean Diane kept the story where my father had chosen to leave his. Children nothing. Only now, I'd have signed the document that proved she was right. I didn't want more than my father gave us. I wanted the truth he'd recognize. The same public record where he had hidden our inheritance 9 years ago was the place I needed to put what had actually happened. He had trusted the record, I would too. Tell them no, I said. Marcus nodded slowly, like he'd expected that, and picked up the phone. The hearing was in a small probate courtroom that smelled of old wood finish and radiator heat. We arrived early. Marcus carried the files. I carried one thin folder, the way I'd learned. The person with the biggest stack of paper is usually the one bluffing. Owen sat beside me with my father's service medal in his closed fist. Across the aisle, Francis Webb kept cleaning his glasses on his tie and looking at the door. Diane arrived like a performance. Her attorney had clearly prepared her, and settled into her chair with the composed certainty of a person who had been waiting 9 months to deliver a verdict she'd already decided. When the clerk distributed our exhibit list to the other table, I watched Webb scan it: recorded deed, notary journal, hospice clinical records, forensic examination, physician statement regarding the forged visitor restriction. I watched the colour leave his face. He leaned over and said something urgent, low, to Diane. She frowned. It was the first time since that funeral reception that I saw her frown. The judge came in. We stood. I put my hand flat on my folder and felt something I hadn't expected. Calm, not confidence, not triumph, just calm. The papers were in order. There was nothing left to do but show them. Diane's side went first. Webb presented the will in a voice working hard to sound certain. He used the word valid 4 times, which I noted. People who are sure of themselves don't need to say it that often. Then Marcus stood. He didn't argue. He laid paper on the table. First, the certified grant deed, county stamp, dated 7 years before Diane. He walked the judge through the transfer line by line. The property had left my father's personal ownership and entered the Weston family trust. The beneficiaries were his children. This deed, Marcus said, predated Diane's marriage to my father by 4 years. Your Honour, Marcus said, a will can only distribute what the decedent personally owned at death. He did not own this property. The judge studied the stamp. Across the aisle, Diane came half out of her chair. Her attorney caught her arm. I didn't move. I'd waited 9 months for this. I let it land without any help from me. When the judge looked up, I spoke for the first time, level, quiet enough that the room had to settle to hear it. You told me at the reception that this house was never really mine, I said to Diane. You were right about that. It was already ours. My father made sure of that before you ever met him. The room went still in a way it had not been still before. Diane's expression did something complicated and then flattened. Marcus set the notary journal beside the hospice records for the same Tuesday in December. He said nothing. He let the judge read them next to each other. The medical records showed a patient who was sedated, unresponsive, and unreachable. The notary journal showed a man who had sat upright in a lawyer's office and signed his name on a legal document. Then he called the hospice nurse. She took the stand in her work cardigan and spoke the way nurses speak, plainly, specifically, without editorial. She described a patient who remained mentally clear almost to the final days, who asked for his son and daughter every single day, who never, not once, requested that their visits be stopped. Marcus asked her the direct question. On the day the notary journal claimed my father had signed his will, could he have appeared in an attorney's office and signed a legal document? She looked at the judge. No, she said. He couldn't have held the pen that day. I looked at Francis Webb. He had stopped cleaning his glasses. He was completely still. The particular stillness of a man watching his own paperwork become the most dangerous thing in the room. His notary journal was supposed to be his protection. Instead, it had locked him to a date the medical records made impossible. Dr. Price walked the judge through the forensic findings in the quiet, methodical way she'd clearly done in 100 courtrooms. Known signatures from the deed, the tax records, the envelope letter, the old birthday card, the signature on the contested will. Side by side under magnification, she described what she found, a signature with the characteristic profile of simulation, copied rather than written. The particular tremor pattern of a hand, working carefully from a model rather than signing its own name. In her professional opinion, the signature on the will had not been written by the same person who had signed every other document in evidence. Marcus laid down the last document. The oncologist's written confirmation that the visitor restriction letter, the letter that had kept us from our father's side for 3 months, bore a forged signature. He noted for the record that this demonstrated the isolation had not been incidental or instinctive. It had been planned, executed in stages, with false documentation at each step. The judge looked at Francis Webb and asked him to explain how he had drafted a will that named himself executor, notarized it himself, and recorded it as witnessed on a day, The medical record showed the signatory was unconscious. Webb opened his mouth. He closed it. He had no answer that didn't make everything worse. That was when Diane broke. She came out of her chair, and the composure she'd been wearing since the funeral, through the phone calls and the gate, and the reception and 9 months of litigation, came off all at once. She told the court she had nursed him, that she'd been there when his own children weren't, that she'd earned that house with her own hands. Her voice climbed and cracked. Belle was crying loudly in the gallery. Diane pointed at me and told the judge I was a stranger trying to steal from a widow. The thing she still didn't understand was that the louder she got, the smaller she looked. I waited until she ran out of breath. Then, into the quiet she left behind, I spoke slowly, fact by fact the way Marcus had laid the documents, level and unhurried. The new lock on the family door installed before they'd buried him. 91 days of voicemail. A nurse who heard my father ask for his children every day until he couldn't speak anymore. A doctor's note that had never existed. I didn't perform grief. I just described events. By the time I finished, the loudest person in that room had become the least believed. The judge ruled from the bench. The will was denied admission to probate. The estate would pass under the trust and under intestate succession to my father's children. The court referred Francis Webb to the state bar and noted the forgery evidence for the district attorney. Outside, in the wide marble corridor, Owen put his arms around me and held on the way he hadn't let himself since the funeral. He still had the service medal in his fist. Neither of us said much for a while. The relatives who'd come for a show filed past. The cousin who had told me we should have visited more, while Dad was alive, didn't meet my eyes. The record was public now, stamped and filed in the same building where my father had hidden the truth 7 years ago. Diane came out last, smaller somehow, Belle at her arm. I had spent months picturing this moment, what I'd say, something sharp and earned. When it arrived, I didn't want any of it. She passed close. I stopped her, my voice level, no heat, no performance. The keys, I said, whenever you're ready. She kept walking. I let her. The aftermath was quieter than the fight. The forged will was gone. The trust did what my father had built it to do, quietly, without drama, exactly as intended. The accounts and the business interest came back to Owen and me under the law. Francis Webb's legal career ended within the year. The state bar completed what the judge had started. Diane left the county before the following winter. I heard the social media account with the photographs of the stone steps, and the new beginning captions went dark gradually, then silent. I felt no rush of victory, only the specific tiredness that comes after a long necessary thing. The first time I walked back into the house as its owner, I used the side door, the family door, the one they'd put a new lock on before they'd finished burying him. I put my own key into that bright brass lock, and it turned, and the door opened into quiet. Owen and I went straight to the study. We opened the windows. We cleared out the thick synthetic candles that had replaced everything, and we cleaned. And within a few weeks, faint and unmistakable, the old smell of the room came creeping back out of the walls. Old wood, old paper. The ghost of pipe tobacco my father had given up for his health, but never quite given up. He came back into that room slowly, the way he'd done everything, without noise, without announcement, just steadily and for keeps. We made the decision the same afternoon. Easy. Once we were standing in there, the house would become a resource centre, for veterans coming home, for families in transition, for people who needed somewhere to land while they found their footing. The people my father had spent his life respecting most. We put the process in motion before we left that day. I forgave myself, finally, for all those nights I'd been patient and polite at a chained door. I hadn't failed him. I had just been fighting a lie that wore official signatures, and no amount of courage or volume or desperation gets you through that. You fight it with the truth, filed correctly, in the right office, in the right order. My father had known that. He'd known it 7 years before he needed it. So that's what I'll leave you with. Not the verdict. Not the money. Not even the keys. The thing that mattered was a quiet man who spent a Sunday afternoon at the county recorder's office, years before anyone knew it would matter, and put the truth somewhere that no lock and no lie and no forged signature could ever reach. He filed it. He trusted it. He pointed me to it when he had almost nothing left. The record outlasted everything they tried to do to him. Keep your paperwork. Tell your truth plainly. File it somewhere it can be found. That's the whole lesson.